25 years betrayed. The private investigator's shocking truth. Chris lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind thick with thoughts that refused to settle. The bedroom was dark except for the dim glow of the alarm clock on the nightstand. 12:07 a.m. Beside him, Amy breathed softly, her body half turned away, lost in the rhythm of sleep, or at least pretending to be. For 25 years, they had shared this bed. 2.5 decades of whispered conversations in the dark, stolen kisses before sunrise, and the quiet comfort of knowing the other was there. Yet tonight, the air between them felt like a chasm, an invisible force stretching wide with unspoken words. Chris exhaled through his nose. He wasn't a jealous man by nature. He wasn't the type to overanalyze or let paranoia take root. But something had shifted in the past few months. Something undeniable. His wife, his Amy, had changed. It wasn't in the obvious ways people joked about when marriages started aging like old furniture. She wasn't suddenly dressing younger or sneaking off at odd hours. No lipstick stains, no perfume-scented shirts. No, it was in the small, intimate ways. For most of their marriage, their love life had been predictable, comfortable but routine. Amy had never been particularly adventurous, never seemed to care much for the passion that Chris sometimes craved. And he had accepted that, as all couples did, because love wasn't just about lust, and real intimacy was built in the moments between, in the touch of a hand or the way she looked at him across the dinner table. But then, almost overnight, things had changed. Suddenly, Amy was different in bed, more confident, more skilled. She did things she had never done before, things that left Chris breathless and spent, reeling from a side of her he had never known existed. And that terrified him, because where had she learned it? Chris turned onto his side, watching the curve of her shoulder in the dim light. "Amy," he murmured. She stirred but didn't open her eyes. Are you awake?" A pause. Then, barely. Chris hesitated, but the words came before he could stop them. "Can I ask you something?" Amy sighed heavily, as if already exasperated. "It's the middle of the night, Chris." "I know, but I can't stop thinking about something." That made her open her eyes. She turned her head slightly, just enough for him to catch the faint glint of irritation in her gaze. "What is it?" she asked. Chris searched her face. His Amy. His beautiful, infuriating, complicated Amy. "After all these years," he said slowly, "why have your skills improved so suddenly?" A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. It was gone in a second, replaced by a smirk, a teasing lilt to her voice. "I didn't hear you complaining." "I'm not," Chris said. "I'm just curious." Amy pushed herself onto one elbow, her expression shifting from playful to guarded. "What are you saying, Chris?" He met her gaze steadily. "I'm saying that for the last 25 years, you've been one way. And now, all of a sudden, you're different. You're better. And I want to know why." Amy's eyes darkened. Her lips parted slightly, as if forming words that refused to come out. Then she scoffed. "Oh my God, are you actually accusing me of something?" Chris shook his head. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just asking for an explanation." She sat up fully now, the sheets pooling around her waist. "So let me get this straight. I try to spice things up, and instead of enjoying it, you assume I must have learned it somewhere else." Chris held his ground. "Did you?" Amy's face twisted with something that looked like both anger and panic. "This is ridiculous." She flung the blankets off and slid out of bed. "You know what? If you don't trust me, then I won't bother trying." She snatched her pillow from the bed and stormed toward the door. Chris remained still. "I guess it won't matter if you tell me the truth now," he said evenly, "because I'll find out tomorrow." Amy froze. Slowly, she turned back to him. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice quiet now. "Careful." Chris sat up, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. "It means," he said, "that the private investigator I hired 6 weeks ago has completed his report. I'm meeting him in the morning." Amy's breath hitched. She took a single step back, as if physically recoiling. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. "Chris," she started, her voice trembling. He stood, crossing the room with slow, measured steps. Then he reached for the bedroom door and shut it. Locked it. He walked back to bed, laid down, and pulled the blanket over himself. Amy's frantic knocking began a moment later. Chris, please. Let me in." He didn't answer. He buried his face into the pillow, his heart breaking with every sob that came from the other side of the door. His world was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Chris awoke before dawn, his body drenched in sweat, his mind racing. The weight of the previous night pressed heavily on his chest. The confrontation with Amy had left him raw, exposed. He had always trusted her, blindly, foolishly. And now, he didn't know who she was anymore. The house was eerily quiet. He could hear the slow tick of the living room clock downstairs, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing in the early morning darkness. Beside him, Amy's absence was palpable. She hadn't returned to bed. Good. Chris pushed back the covers and swung his legs over the side of the mattress. His feet met the cold wooden floor, a stark contrast to the warmth of the bed they had once shared with love, with trust, with a false sense of security. He checked his phone. 3 a.m. 17 unread messages. Amy. Chris, please, we need to talk. Amy. I made a mistake yelling at you. I was caught off guard. Amy. Where are you? I can't sleep. Amy. You're scaring me. Amy. Do you hate me? Chris exhaled through his nose and powered off the phone. He couldn't engage with her now. He needed clarity. He needed proof. And he needed to prepare himself for what was coming. Throwing on his running gear, he stepped outside. The air was crisp, biting at his skin. It smelled of damp pavement and the faintest trace of morning dew. He took off down the street, his breath coming in controlled bursts, his mind a storm of anger, confusion, and grief. With each stride, he replayed the past few weeks, dissecting every interaction, every shift in Amy's behavior. It had started so subtly. The distant looks, the mysterious phone calls, the sudden increase in late nights at work. Then, the more obvious signs. The new lingerie. Pieces he had never seen before. Pieces she never wore for him. The renewed enthusiasm in bed. Passionate. Unexpected. Foreign. The secrecy. A locked phone. Hesitation when he entered the room. The soft chime of notifications in the middle of the night. Had he been blind or simply in denial? He pushed harder, running faster, his feet pounding against the pavement, as if he could outrun the truth itself. But the truth was already waiting for him, inside a thick manila folder, sitting in a private investigator's office. And today, he would face it. By 6 a.m., Chris found himself at Lucy's, a small, old-school diner he had frequented for years. The booths were worn, the coffee strong, the air thick with the scent of bacon and syrup. He sat by the window, staring out at the city waking up. Deep breath. He powered his phone back on. 24 unread messages. He ignored them all and texted Stacy, his boss and longtime friend. Can you meet me at Lucy's before work? No rush. 15 minutes later, she slid into the booth across from him, setting down her oversized to-go mug of coffee. You look like hell, she said matter-of-factly. Chris smirked tiredly. Thanks. That's exactly what I needed to hear. I mean it, Chris. You're pale, your eyes are bloodshot, and you look like you haven't slept in a year. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I feel worse than I look. Stacy studied him. Is it Amy? Chris hesitated, then nodded. I think she's cheating on me. For the first time, he said the words aloud, and saying them hurt worse than he had imagined. Stacy leaned back, silent for a moment. I don't know what to say. Are you sure? Chris took a sip of his coffee, bitter and scalding, before answering. I hired a PI. Today, I get the report. Stacy's eyes widened slightly. Jesus, Chris. Yeah. A long pause. Then, Stacy reached in her purse, pulled out a small silver key, and slid it across the table. Take our cottage. Chris blinked. What? It's 35 minutes away. It's quiet. No distractions. You need space, Chris. And you're not going to get it at home. Chris stared at the key, then at Stacy. I don't know what to say. Say you'll hold on, Stacy said gently, because this is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Chris exhaled slowly and pocketed the key. I'll let you know how it goes, he muttered. I'll be waiting. And with that, Chris stood, bracing himself for what came next. At exactly 9 a.m., Chris stepped into a dimly lit office, its walls lined with filing cabinets and surveillance photos. The man behind the desk, grizzled, efficient, and straight to the point, didn't waste time with pleasantries. A thick folder sat between them. Are you sure you want to see this? The investigator asked. Chris swallowed hard. Show me. The first image was relatively harmless. Amy having lunch with a man at a trendy bistro, smiling at him with a warmth that sent a sharp stab of pain through Chris's chest. The next image? Less innocent. The man's hand on hers, fingers lightly tracing her palm. Then came the kiss. Chris clenched his fists as the investigator continued flipping through the photos. The man, Mike Brooks, was an attractive, well-dressed real estate agent, one Amy had worked with for over a year. Hotel records, text logs, screenshots, a pattern of deception meticulously laid out before him. They've been meeting for months, the investigator said, possibly longer. Chris felt the air leave his lungs. This was real. This was happening. He pushed the folder away and stood. His legs felt unsteady, his mind foggy. Thank you, he muttered, barely audible. The investigator nodded. Good luck, Mr. Carter. Chris turned and walked out of the office, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him like an unbearable storm. There was no denying it now, no rationalizing. Amy had chosen someone else. And now Chris had to decide what came next. The office smelled of stale coffee and ink, like a place where secrets were both uncovered and buried. The blinds were half closed, allowing only slivers of the mid-morning light to cut across the wooden desk where Chris sat, his hands clenched into tight fists. Across from him, the private investigator, Dan Keller, leaned back in his chair, the thick manila folder resting between them like a loaded gun. Are you sure you want to see this? Keller asked, his voice steady, almost sympathetic. Chris let out a slow breath. Was he ready? No. Would he ever be? Probably not. But he had come too far to turn back now. Show me, he said. Keller flipped the folder open with the precision of a surgeon making the first incision. The first few photos were benign. Amy sitting across from a man at a cafe, her expression warm, her smile lingering just a little too long. Chris's stomach twisted. That was the smile she used to give him when they were young, when she would reach across the table and playfully steal fries from his plate. Then came the next set of pictures. The same man, tall, fit, slightly graying at the temples, sitting beside Amy on a park bench. Their shoulders touched. His hand rested on her thigh. Amy's fingers, delicate and familiar, brushed against his wrist. Chris swallowed hard. Then came the photo that burned itself into his brain. A kiss. Amy's lips pressed against the man's, her hands tangled in his hair. It wasn't hesitant or uncertain. It was the kiss of two people who had done this before, of two people who had nothing to hide from each other. Chris felt his heartbeat slow, as if his body were bracing for impact. He wanted to look away, to unsee what had just been burned into his mind. But he couldn't. His name is Mike Brooks, Keller said, flipping the page to a detailed report. Commercial real estate agent. Divorced. No kids. He and your wife have been seeing each other for at least 6 months, maybe longer. Chris exhaled sharply. 6 months. He did the math. That was around the time Amy's behavior had changed. The newfound interest in her appearance, the sudden enthusiasm in the bedroom, the unexplained nights out with friends. We tracked their meetings, Keller continued. Weekday lunches. Afternoon rendezvous at a small rental property. Late night texts. Calls at odd hours. Chris barely heard him. He was fixated on the next document, a hotel invoice. His fingers hovered over it for a moment before finally picking it up. The Midtown Regency. A corner suite. Paid in cash. Booked under a fake name. A nauseating realization settled in his gut. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some fleeting, drunken lapse in judgment. It was premeditated, repeated, hidden. I have more, Keller said cautiously. Texts. Call logs. If you want them. Chris shook his head. I've seen enough. He closed the folder and sat back, staring at the ceiling, trying to hold himself together. He had suspected. God, he had known. But seeing it laid out so coldly, so undeniably, shattered any last remnants of hope he had been clinging to. What do you want to do next? Keller asked. Chris ran a hand over his face. He had no idea. All he knew was that when he walked out of that office, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Chris parked his car outside the university's student union, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded in his chest, not out of anger but out of dread. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times. He had tried to soften the words, to find a way to tell his daughters without shattering their world. But the truth was jagged, and no matter how carefully he chose his words, it would still cut them deep. A few minutes later, Julie and Kate arrived. Julie, the eldest, was tall and confident, her dark brown hair tied in a loose ponytail. She had inherited his sharp eyes, always observant, always questioning. Kate, 2 years younger, was softer, quieter, with Amy's blonde curls and gentle demeanor. Chris forced a smile as they sat down across from him. Dad, what's wrong? Julie asked immediately. Kate frowned, tucking her hair behind her ear. Yeah, you sounded really weird on the phone. Chris exhaled slowly. No more delaying. Girls, he said, his voice low and measured, there's something I need to tell you, and it's going to be painful. I found out recently that your mother has been, he swallowed hard, seeing someone else. For a few seconds, the only sound was the distant hum of conversation from other students around them. Julie blinked. Wait, what do you mean? Chris met her gaze. She's having an affair. Kate's breath hitched, her face going pale. Julie shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. No way. That's ridiculous. Mom would never do that. Chris sighed, then pulled out his phone. He hesitated, then placed it on the table and turned the screen toward them. A photograph. Amy, wrapped in the arms of a man they had never seen before, kissing him in broad daylight on the steps of a house she and Chris were supposed to be selling together. Julie's mouth fell open. She stared at the image, her hands curling into fists. Kate covered her face with both hands and let out a strangled sob. No, 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 no. This can't be real. Chris reached out, his voice pained. I wish it weren't. Julie grabbed the phone and scrolled. A text thread. Hotel records. More pictures. Each piece of evidence struck like a hammer, shattering the illusion they had of their mother. How long? Julie's voice was hoarse. Chris hesitated. At least a few months. Maybe longer. Kate let out another sob, and Julie slammed the phone down on the table, her jaw clenched so tightly that Chris thought she might break a tooth. That lying, she started, but stopped herself, breathing heavily through her nose. Kate wiped her tears and looked at her father with big, broken eyes. Are you going to divorce her? Chris closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded. I don't see any other way. Julie scoffed. Good. She deserves it. Chris exhaled. Listen to me, both of you. No matter what happens, she's still your mother. I know you're angry, but try to... No. Julie cut him off, her voice sharp. Don't ask us to be okay with this. Don't ask us to forgive her right now. Kate, still sniffling, checked her phone. She's been calling me all day. Julie's phone started buzzing too. Amy's name lit up on the screen. Without hesitation, Julie answered. Mom, she said, her voice eerily calm. Chris could hear Amy's frantic voice on the other end. Julie, oh thank God. Listen, sweetheart, I need to talk to you and your sister. Julie cut her off. Sorry, Mom, but Kate and I are busy right now. We're comforting Dad. You know, the man you betrayed. Chris saw Kate's hands tremble as she stared at her lap, fresh tears slipping down her cheeks. Amy's voice turned panicked. Julie, please, let me explain. Explain what? Julie snapped. That you cheated? That you lied to all of us? That you broke our family apart? Chris reached out to stop her, but Julie wasn't done. You know what, Mom? If you need someone to talk to, maybe you should try your boyfriend. Then she hung up. For a moment, they all just sat there, the weight of everything pressing down on them. Chris finally spoke. Girls, I know you're hurt. I am too, but I don't want you to let this poison your hearts. Julie wiped a tear from her cheek, her face hard. Too late. Kate sniffled, looking up at Chris with swollen eyes. What happens now? Chris took a deep breath. Now, we move forward. Together. Kate nodded. Julie said nothing. And as Chris looked at his daughters, he realized that Amy hadn't just betrayed him. She had shattered them all. Chris pulled into his parents' driveway just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The familiar two-story house, with its weathered brick facade and flower beds his mother tended to religiously, looked unchanged. But tonight, everything felt different. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he stared at the porch light, flickering slightly in the cold evening air. He hadn't told them why he was coming. Just a simple text. I need to talk. It's serious. Now that he was here, the weight of his reality settled like a stone in his chest. He stepped out of the car, and before he could even take a full breath, his father appeared from the side of the house, wiping his hands on an old rag. At 73, Robert Andrews still worked with his hands, fixing things, maintaining order, always solving problems. But this was something even he couldn't fix. Son. Chris didn't even respond. He just let his father pull him into a firm embrace, the kind that said you don't have to carry this alone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Chris closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of sawdust and engine oil that clung to his father's flannel jacket. The scent of home, the scent of safety. But there was no safety from this. When they finally pulled apart, his father studied his face with narrowed eyes. Come inside, Chris. Your mother's been pacing since you texted. Chris nodded, following his father up the porch steps. The old wooden boards creaked beneath his weight, a sound he had heard 1,000 times growing up, sneaking in past curfew or coming home late from football practice. Inside, the house smelled like baked bread and lavender, a warm contrast to the cold, sharp reality slicing through him. Margaret Andrews appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. The moment she saw Chris's face, her expression fell. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered. Chris didn't think. He just walked toward her, and in an instant, his mother wrapped her arms around him, rubbing his back the way she used to when he was a child waking from a nightmare. Only this nightmare wasn't going to fade when the sun rose. She guided him to the living room, where a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. His father settled into his usual armchair, while Chris and his mother sat on the couch. All right, his father said after a long silence. Tell us what happened. Chris swallowed hard, his throat tight. Amy, she's been having an affair. His mother gasped, covering her mouth. His father stiffened, his weathered hands gripping the armrests. Are you sure? His mother asked, her voice trembling. Chris nodded. I hired a private investigator. I have proof. His father exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Jesus Christ. His mother's eyes filled with tears. Oh, Christopher, I never thought. She always seemed so devoted to you. So did I. His voice cracked. For 25 years, Mom. 25 years. And she threw it all away. His mother reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. I am so sorry. His father remained quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Then he muttered, Who is he? Chris hesitated before answering. His name is Mike Brooks. Some real estate guy. I don't know much else, but it's been going on for a while. His father clenched his jaw, his old military instincts kicking in. You want me to handle it? Chris almost laughed, despite the pain. That was just like his dad, direct, protective, always ready to fight for his family. No, Dad, Chris sighed. This isn't a battle you can win for me. I have to handle this myself. His father grunted, but didn't push further. Margaret wiped at her tears, voice shaking. Chris, is there any chance of saving your marriage? Maybe counseling or... No, Chris said firmly. I can't forgive this. She didn't make a mistake, Mom. She made a choice. Repeatedly. Behind my back. And now I have to make mine. His mother let out a quiet sob. I never wanted this for you. Neither did I. The fire crackled, filling the silence. The weight of everything pressed down on them, on all of them. After a long pause, his father spoke again. Well, if you need a place to stay, you're always welcome here. Chris nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. Thanks, Dad. His mother reached out again, tucking a stray lock of hair behind his ear like she used to when he was little. You're strong, Chris, but you don't have to go through this alone. Chris felt something crack inside him. For the first time in days, he let himself cry. Not in anger, not in frustration, but in raw, soul-crushing grief. And in the warmth of his childhood home, between the love of his parents, he let himself be their son again. Chris pulled into the driveway and killed the engine, but he didn't move. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the leather. Inside the house, his house, Amy was waiting. He could see her silhouette through the living room window, pacing, stopping, wringing her hands. He exhaled slowly. He had prepared for this moment, but no amount of preparation could soften the blow of facing the woman he had loved for over 2 decades, the woman who had betrayed him. Finally, he forced himself out of the car, his steps heavy as he climbed the porch stairs. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before pushing it open. Amy was on him in an instant. Chris, please. She grabbed his arm, her fingers desperate, trembling. We need to talk. Chris stepped past her, shaking her off as he walked into the living room. He let his briefcase drop onto the coffee table with a dull thud. Talk, he said, his voice quiet but cutting. Now you want to talk? Amy swallowed hard. She had been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face blotchy. She wore his favorite sweater, an old, oversized one of his that she always stole in the winter. For a split second, he hated himself for still noticing how small she looked in it. She nodded quickly. Yes, please, just hear me out. Chris turned slowly to face her, his expression unreadable. Okay, he said, crossing his arms. Talk. Amy hesitated, licking her lips as if choosing her words carefully. Then, finally, she whispered, I made a mistake. Chris scoffed, shaking his head. No, Amy. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is burning dinner. What you did, that was a choice. She flinched at his words. It wasn't like that, she said desperately. Chris, you have to understand. Understand what? His voice was sharp now, his patience unraveling. That you threw away 25 years for some guy? That you let me kiss you, hold you, sleep next to you every night while you lied to my face? Tears spilled down her cheeks. I never meant to hurt you. Chris laughed, but there was no humor in it. Never meant to hurt me? Do you think that makes this better? Amy stepped forward, reaching for his hands, but he pulled back. Chris, I was lonely, she admitted. You were always working, always distracted. I felt invisible. I needed to feel wanted again. Chris stared at her, stunned. So your solution was to run to another man? His voice was eerily calm now, and that seemed to scare her more than his anger. Instead of talking to me, instead of telling me you were unhappy, you just, what? Took the easy way out. Amy sobbed. I don't have an excuse. I was selfish. I ruined everything. But Chris, I love you. I do, and I don't want to lose you. Chris exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. You already lost me, Amy. The words hit her like a physical blow. She gasped. clutching her stomach as if trying to keep herself from crumbling. "Chris, please. Stop," he said, closing his eyes for a brief moment. When he looked at her again, there was no softness left in his gaze. "You don't get to beg me now. You made your choice, and now I have to make mine." Amy's sobs turned frantic. "We can fix this. We can go to therapy. We can." "No," Chris said firmly. "You don't get to decide that. Not anymore." A heavy silence filled the room. Chris turned toward the staircase. "I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with my lawyer." Amy choked on a sob. "Ew, you're really going to divorce me?" Chris looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't see any other way." And with that, he walked away, leaving Amy alone in the wreckage of what she had destroyed. Chris sat in the sleek, glass-walled office of his lawyer, Mark Reynolds, watching as the man spread a stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany desk. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a slow, suffocating tide. "Are you ready for this?" Mark asked, his voice steady, professional, but not without empathy. Chris exhaled sharply. "Ready? No. But prepared? Perhaps. As ready as I'll ever be." Mark slid the papers toward him. The words "petition for dissolution of marriage" stood out in bold at the top of the first page. Chris stared at them, as if by reading them again, he could rewrite the past. He picked up the pen. His hand hovered for just a moment. 25 years. Gone. His mind drifted, unbidden, to the first time he saw Amy. She had been laughing, loud, unapologetically joyful, her sundress catching in the summer breeze. He had been mesmerized, convinced that she was the woman he'd spend forever with. And he had, in a way, until she decided forever had an expiration date. "Chris." Mark's voice brought him back. Chris inhaled, gripped the pen, and signed. The ink bled onto the paper in smooth, final strokes, solidifying what he already knew. It was done. The world did not shatter. The ceiling did not cave in. The weight in his chest, however, was unbearable. Mark flipped the stack over and tapped it into a neat pile. Once Amy signs, the process officially starts. Given your assets and mutual agreements, we're looking at 6 months to finalize. 6 months, Chris echoed, as if the time frame meant anything. He had already lost what mattered most. The paperwork was just a formality. Mark leaned back. "How did she take it?" Chris let out a bitter laugh. "How do you think?" Denial, pleading, then anger. "She swore she never meant to hurt me, as if that somehow negates the fact that she did." Mark nodded knowingly. "They always do." Chris studied him. "You sound like you've seen this before." "More times than I care to count." Mark laced his fingers together. "You loved her. That's clear. But now, you have to let go of the illusion that love was enough to make her stay." Chris swallowed. He knew Mark was right. But knowing and accepting were two different things. Chris left the office feeling numb. The sun was bright, the world around him moving as if nothing had changed. People laughing, walking, living. How dare they? Didn't they know the ground beneath his feet had cracked open? His phone vibrated. Amy. He let it ring. Then, another notification. A text. "Amy, Chris, please. We need to talk." He shut off his phone. Instead of heading home, he drove, without a destination, just moving, trying to escape the unbearable stillness of grief. Somehow, he ended up in front of Lucy's diner, the place where just days ago, Stacy had handed him the key to her family cottage. Maybe it was time to use it. That evening, Chris returned home, knowing Amy would be waiting. She was in the living room, pacing, red-eyed, clutching a crumpled tissue. The moment she saw him, she rushed forward. "Chris, please." He held up a hand. "Stop." She froze. "We're beyond this, Amy. You made a choice. Now, I'm making mine." Tears streamed down her face. "I was stupid. I was selfish. I thought, God, I don't even know what I thought. But I love you, Chris. I do." He closed his eyes. "Maybe you do." He took a deep breath. "But not enough." Her sobs turned to silent tremors. Chris stepped past her, up the stairs, and into the bedroom they once shared. He packed a single bag, clothes, toiletries, a few personal things. Then he paused, staring at the wedding photo on his nightstand. The smiles, the promises, the lie. He left it behind. When he came downstairs, Amy was standing at the door, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her world together. "Where will you go?" she whispered. "Somewhere I can breathe," he replied. And with that, he walked out. For the first time in 25 years, he was free.